So as we come together today, we're going to continue in our month of gratitude, in our understanding of what gratitude is and why it is an important spiritual practice, what it does for us, how it helps us to grow, how it helps us to really feel more connected to all of life. And this the topic for today, in all things give thanks. This was something that came to me several weeks ago, certainly before the events of Friday, and I had to stop and think: is it something that's appropriate? Is because I know that this is weighing heavily on everybody's mind. Is it something appropriate? In all things give thanks. How in the world, in the midst of this, in this terror, how in the midst of this sadness, can we possibly give thanks? And I realized that it was probably the perfect topic for helping us to process what has happened. Because what we must learn as our definition of gratitude, as our understanding of gratitude changes, as we talked last week, we must come to some understanding of why bad things happen to good people. Why would a kind and loving and a caring God allow something like this to happen? And how in the world do we, as spiritual beings, as people who are dedicated to awakening to not only our own spiritual nature, but to the spiritual nature of all humankind, and including the humans who commit the atrocities, to recognize the spiritual nature of all humankind is what our goal is, if we have a goal, but it is certainly what our practice is. Dr. Holmes told us that the business of a practitioner, now a practitioner in his definition was somebody who used the law of mind, who used the power of prayer for a definite purpose. And in that regard, we're all practitioners. We all pray. But he said that it is the business of the practitioner to simply uncover God, uncover more of God wherever we go, whatever we are looking at. That's our role. That is our practice. To judge not by appearances, but to be able to look into the midst of the chaos, the midst of the confusion, and find the peace. That's sort of the challenge, excuse me, that we have. So this idea of in all things give thanks, especially in light of the confusion and the atrocities of the last several days, it seems to me that it is the perfect thing for us to consider. What does that mean? What does that even mean, in all things give thanks? How do you do that? How can you possibly do it? Why should you do it? All of those things that I think help us to not only get to a deeper understanding of what gratitude is, but helps us to get to a deeper understanding of why such terrible things happen in the course of human experience. So that's what we want to look at today. Now, the first thing I want to say is that this Bible quote, the one that I'm talking about, comes from New Testament. It comes from Thessalonians. It is often misquoted, and it is probably just as often only partially quoted. We love to do that as human beings. We love to take a little snippet of something and say, well, this part I'll take, but that part over there, I think I'll leave it behind. So the first thing about the misquote is sometimes people say, well, we're supposed to give thanks for all things. And that's not what it says at all. It says in all things, in all things. So even while the bad things are going on, can I find a way to find gratitude in my heart? And that's totally different than saying, well, thank you, God, for sending this terrible time to us. Thank you, God, for sending these atrocities to us. We're grateful for them. That's a bit ridiculous when you put it that way, and I meant it to be that way. Perhaps the best dramatization of that I ever saw and you know I love old movies, was old John Ford Western, and it had John Wayne and Ward Bond and that whole John Ford gang in there, and it was the Searchers, you know, and and there's a scene in the movie. There's this one guy who was always part of the John Ford cadre of actors, and I just unfortunately I don't remember his name, but you'd know him if you saw him. He was a tall, skinny man with a bald head, and they usually gave him a name Moses or something like that. And he was part of this band, that John Wayne's little troop of men who were going out, and they were trying to track down the people who had kidnapped John Wayne's niece. That's what the title is about, The Searchers. I think Montgomery Clift might have been in this movie as a side. So there's a part where the John Wayne and his little group of men, they're about to catch up with the people who had kidnapped this girl, who was Natalie Wood, and the kidnappers turn to attack. They're going to come back and they're going to attack. So John Wayne's little cadre there, they kind of set up a little barricade to kneel behind so that they can defend themselves from this attack. And as they're being charged upon, this character named Moses takes his hat off his head, he puts it over his heart, and he says, "O Lord, for that which we're about to receive, we give thanks." And Ward Bond turns around and just slaps him. He says, "Put your hat on, you crazy old coot," or something like that. For that which we're about to receive, even this enemy attack that we are about to receive, the death and destruction we are about to go through, we give thanks. And it just really epitomizes how ludicrous the idea is that for all things we should give thanks. For all things we should give thanks. And people trying to justify that, they try to say, well, you know, God sent me this. God sent me this test. God sent me this punishment. God sent me this hard time as a way of waking me up, as a way of moving me forward. You know, God gave me this. If somebody considers themselves to be really good, God gave me this burden to bear because God knew that I could stand it. You know, and somehow it pleases God that I'm suffering in this way. And we really have to look at that and say, you know, that is, remember last week we talked about the three levels of consciousness, and we talked about the different worldview and how we look at things. And those things that I just mentioned, they come from the first level. They come from a level of superstition. They come from a level of reacting and responding. You know, the power is out there, and somehow we have to figure out how to behave in a manner to please that power. So if that power is responsible for everything, then it must be responsible for the hard times that I have fallen upon. And perhaps if I am grateful, if I express my gratitude, perhaps somehow that will help me in my growth. You know, we're still trying to bargain. Now, just briefly, that kind of goes into, and I said the quote was not only misquoted, but it was only partially quoted. The total quote is, it says, in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God. For this is the will of God. And that for the will of God and for all things give thanks, kind of, you can see how they blend together. If this is the will of God, then I must be grateful in it, because, you know, God is doing this to me, or God is doing this for me, or God is somehow responsible for all of these things. You know, we're really getting into the what the theologians would call the problem of evil, which is, if God is so good, why does evil exist? You know, why does God allow evil to exist? If God knows everything, omniscience, all-knowing, then it would have to know that it it created us, and some of us would invariably do things that we shouldn't do. And then it turns around and it condemns us to suffer for an eternity. I'm talking about old school theology now. And that was the way that this, you know, the theologians kind of wrestle with it. Does that, you know, is that coherent? Does that make sense? So in the Old Testament, we have the book of Job, which I believe is greatly misunderstood in our time. It was a book the way that I read it, a book of satire and sarcasm. And what was what was happening is people were trying to, or the authors of Job, what they were doing was they were poking holes in everybody's explanation of why bad things happen to good people. And Rabbi Harold Kushner probably wrote a great modern day exploration of the book of Job in his book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he kind of explains, the ideas that are laid out in Job in a more modern language, something that we can kind of get our mind around, And the idea is that God and the devil make a bet, so you have to understand that this is not something that's literally true, and the devil, of course, in this culture is not the devil as we know it today, right? Satan, in the ancient culture, the idea of Satan was that the obstacles that impede us, the things that we perhaps allow come into our own way in order to impede us. And the idea there is that if it weren't difficult, if there weren't obstacles, we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't grow. We'd never move. We'd lay on the couch all day with a remote control in our hand, watching infomercials or something like that. But it is the challenge. It is the seeming challenge of something that awakens within us a desire to get it done. So in this regard, in the ancient way of thinking, in the culture from which this idea comes to us, the devil was not a fallen angel, or Satan was not a fallen angel who was there to try to steal souls for eternity and take them to hell, but was rather someone who helped people grow by nudging them along, by making things uncomfortable, by moving them out of their comfort zone. Right? So if we sit too long on the couch, we start to get ill because our body isn't getting enough exercise. We swing over to a point where we have reached discomfort, and then we start to do something, and we may join a gym and we may go exercise, and we may get serious about it, and we may get ourselves very, very fit, or we may just get fit enough to stop feeling ill. Somewhere in there is the way human beings tend to do. So this idea then that God sent us the discomfort and it's a blessing and we should be grateful for it, that's how this idea kind of creeps into our thinking, because people stop and think. When something's not going the way that they want it to go, they stop and think and they say, what's this all about? What is this all about? And when we stop and think and ask ourselves, what is this all about? We can find a deeper meaning. We can find a deeper lesson in what's going on. And then what we tend to do is we tend to say, oh, you see, God sent me this situation to teach me that lesson. We wrap it all up nice and neatly in our way of thinking. But God didn't send us the pain or the suffering. The divine could not do that. We have to go back to this first level of superstition, and we have to realize that in the worldview that believes in superstition, yes, God has enemies just like we have enemies. God gets angry just like we get angry. God punishes people just like we want people to be punished, But the divine cannot wish for you and I anything it would not wish for itself. Anything that it would not wish for itself. The fact is if we would stop in the middle of every day, even when things are going extraordinarily well, if we would stop in the middle and ask ourselves, what is this all about? Is there something for me to learn here? We would find a lesson. We would find a lesson. So what I'm saying is, we don't tend, as human beings, we don't tend to stop and ask ourselves, what can I learn today? How can I grow today? We don't tend to do that on an ongoing basis. But when something's not going the way we want it to go, when something's going the way we think, hey, this shouldn't be happening to me, why is this going on? Then we stop and we tend to get our lesson out of it. So I want you to consider then that this idea of in all things give thanks because it's God's will. What does that mean? See, the traditional interpretations, as I say, the way people have been interpreting it for a long time has been based on this idea that somehow God could send sickness, pain, and suffering and tragedy to us as a way of moving us along, or somehow God could allow the power of evil, the prince of darkness, which, by the way, the prince of darkness came from Persia, Zoroastrianism. The idea of Satan as the devil did not exist in Judaism until after the Babylonian captivity, for those who are interested in going to study it. Right? So people were trying to understand. We're always trying to understand. We're trying to make sense. Maybe it's Gestalt. I don't know. We're always trying to take little pieces of a puzzle and we're trying to put them together and make sense. And we're trying to put together and understand why, if God is so good, does pain and suffering exist? Why, if God is so good, do these terrible things happen as we go through life? And one way that one theological school answered it was, well, because there's a devil that does this to us, that brings this to us. And another one said, well, there's a God who sends us these things because they're good for us, even though we don't know that they're good for us. So in the book of Job, the people kind of go down all of the reasons why God would have done this to Job. All of the reasons that God would be punishing Job, or God would be testing Job, or God would be strengthening Job, and all of these different reasons are being given. And one by one, these reasons are shot down in the book, that God wouldn't do these things. And Job, in the midst of all of the trials and tribulations, Job refuses to lash out at God. He's going to continue to trust in his God. Now, the book of Job doesn't solve the riddle for us, but the book of Job, the way that it ends it just says, what makes you think that you can understand how God works? What makes you think that you're capable of reasoning and figuring it out? And there's things that God does, and there's things that God knows that you'll never understand. So just accept it. Just accept the fact that there's a better reason or a bigger reason than you'll ever figure out, and don't try to figure it out anymore. Kind of. And this is my read, my take on it, right? I'm sure that there are others. Which in kind of, if you step back far enough away from it and look at it, it's almost where Buddhism brings us with the first noble truth, which is pain and suffering exist. Right? All of life is suffering. That's the first noble truth of Buddhism. It is. It just is. In Buddhism, they kind of talk about, well, the game was already in progress when we joined it. We didn't make the rules. We just kind of found ourselves here and awakened while things were in progress. So we can spend a lot of time trying to figure out why pain and suffering, why did we choose to come here? If we could do that, why were we sent here to suffer? Or we can start to learn why pain and suffering exist and what we can do to eliminate pain and suffering, not only in our lives, but the lives of all sentient beings, right? The compassion for all sentient beings. So we come now back to this idea that in all things give thanks, for it is God's will. In all things give thanks, for this is God's will. So we have these things that are going on that are, it's easy for us to give thanks when things are going okay. When an unexpected check for $1,000 arrives in the mail, it's easy for us to give thanks. It's easy for us to say, thank you, God. It's easy for us to take out our checkbook and say, I'm gonna send some of this to my favorite charity and share the good. It's easy for us to do that when things are going well. It's not so easy for us to do that when things are not going well. We tend not to think, well, this is the time to give gratitude. The mortgage company just sent me a certified letter and said I've got 90 days to get out of the house because I haven't paid my mortgage. It's not very likely at that time that we're going to say, well, thank you, God, thank you, God. Now, we can certainly, as I say, look back, and a lot of what you read, when you read about people dealing, especially metaphysical people dealing with issues, we can certainly look back and see that at times these things that seem to be not so good were in fact moving us towards something even better. Probably the greatest example of that is we get fired from a job that we weren't happy in anyway, and then part of us is devastated by the fact that we got fired, and then part of us says, wait a minute, this is a good thing. See, this is a good thing. This is an opportunity for me now to go out and get the kind of job that I've always wanted, or to do something else with my life. So we can at times, in the midst of things that are going not so well, we may in fact be able to look into it, and we can have a little bit of gratitude and say, wait a minute, there's a kernel of good in here, right? I guess it was W. Clement Stone in Napoleon Hill said, within every adversity is the seed of an equal or greater benefit, right? And their whole book was just full of little slogans and axioms like that. Self-help and motivation. And within every adversity is the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And this is the idea of when you have lemons, you make lemonade. So there is some benefit for us to when things are not going right, or going the way we consider them to be right or well, we can look at them and we can say, well, there must be a reason for this. There must be another way. We can be thankful that this is going on because it's going to lead us to a different experience or a better experience. And that's okay. It's okay as far as it goes. There's nothing wrong with that. See, gratitude helps us to see a different perspective, see a different worldview, see things differently. And it is only when we see things differently that we can get out of them, right? Because if we can't, we just stay stuck in this the movie Groundhog Day all over again. Every day we get up and it's the same day all over again. And if you look at that movie with Bill Murray, for a while he realized that everything was happening over and over and over again, and the first thing he tried to do was to figure out how to manipulate it for his benefit. And he did that. But then after a while he got bored with that. You see, he got bored and he decided to use the time to grow. And when he embarked on a path of personal growth, that's when he was able to break out of the cycle of Groundhog Day. So we want to be able to grow. Even in the midst of adversity, we want to be able to grow. We want to be able to see things differently. We don't want to get sucked in and caught up in the drama to the point where we just get stuck and we do this over and over and over again. We want to find the way out, right? The exit. We want to find the way out. We want to find the way into a deeper experience of God, a deeper experience of the presence of God. And I want you to consider for just a moment that we as human beings, for the entire recorded history of humanity, and certainly for a much longer period of time before that, but certainly for the entire recorded history of humanity, we have been killing one another. We have been committing atrocities against one another forever. Some of the earliest recorded records are records of battles. Even in the Upanishads, even in the sacred scriptures of the Hindus, some of the first ones are about battle and about the problem of people going into battle. How can they justify going into battle as spiritual beings? And all of these deep questions. So this outpicturing of man's inhumanity to man has been going on for as long as we know. It has been going on. And the human consciousness has not changed that. If anything, we have developed more efficient means of being inhumane to one another, more effective means of being inhumane to one another. And when something like Paris, when something like that happens, our sense of how terrible, how awful these things are, it comes to us. It comes right to us, But over time it fades. One of the programs that we were watching the other night, the news commentator signed off and basically said, but we've been here before. We've been at this very spot before. 6 months ago, we were at this spot before. We were outraged. A year ago, we were at this spot before. What has changed? What has changed? It seems like things come up, and then we kind of get over them, and we forget about them, and then they happen again. But what has been happening for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it has been happening because it is part of the human consciousness. It is part of the human consciousness that accepts that these things happen. It is part of the human consciousness that accepts the idea that we have the right to kill one another. Now, in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God. But what is God's will? What is God's will? Is it God's will that we should kill one another? Is it God's will that we should be unkind to one another? Is it God's will that we should be hungry or poor or frightened? Is it God's will that we should suffer and be sick? And we have to think about that and ask ourselves, what do I really believe about that? What do I really believe about that? Now, at level 1 consciousness, we believe, yes, it is God's will. Somehow it pleases God. Somehow it teaches us a lesson. Somehow it helps us to grow. Somehow it helps us to be strong. And we also come to the rationalization that the other people who do things like this to us, they do that because they don't know our God, you see. They're evil. They're wicked. And the solution then is just simply to bring everybody over to our way of thinking, whatever that way of thinking happens to be, to convert them for their own good, to convert them. And of course that hasn't worked. That has never worked. We've been trying that. We've been trying that for all of recorded history. That doesn't work. Then we kind of grow and we come to ask ourselves, well, who am I? Why am I here? And what is God's will? If we could be so bold as to think that we could understand God's will. And the book of Job tells us we cannot. Perhaps not entirely. But if we think that what we are, and this includes all people, right, even those people who would do us harm, if we think about what we are each a unique individualized expression of the divine. Each and every one of us, right? That which we call the soul, the human soul, our soul. Perhaps human and soul don't go together, but that which we call our soul is that point where the divine has become individualized as us, right? That the soul is part of the very Spirit of God, taking on the persona that we recognize as us. And that can never be desecrated. I mean, it can never be destroyed. Right? The poet said we can cover it up, we can desecrate it, but we can never destroy it. But if each and every one of us is some part of the divine, if God is expressing itself in, as, and through each and every one of us, then we have to come to at least get our minds to consider the idea that what God's will for us is its whatever its will for itself is. If each and every one of us is some part of the divine, then how could it wish us or will us pain and suffering? If you think about it even more, the divine mind cannot know what pain and suffering is. Right? Because what God knows, God experiences. And the divine cannot suffer. Right? It just couldn't be, right? Like the computer in Star Trek, it does not compute. So if it is perfect, whole, and complete, and it can only will for us what it wills for itself, it cannot will for us imperfection or disease or suffering. So now we're stuck. Now we're stuck in our thinking. We say, well, wait a second. If we're supposed to give, in all things, we're supposed to give thanks because it's God's will, and God God could not will these terrible things to happen to us, then how can it be? How can it be? And we go back to recognize that the divine has created us out of itself and left us alone to make the discovery. Right? That, as Dr. Holmes says, we could not be created fully enlightened. Fully awakened is perhaps a better way to put it. Fully aware of our oneness with God. That this is something that we have to work out for ourselves as our soul evolves over time, as we grow, as we have different experiences, as we contemplate them, as we engage in our spiritual practice. And I'll say that again, as we engage in our spiritual practice, the most important thing that we can do, we begin to awaken. We begin to become aware. And the reason that we were left alone to make this discovery was that it was necessary in order for us to be individual, be individualized expressions of God. If we were all created fully enlightened, fully awakened, and fully aware, we would all be exactly the same. And the divine has created us to have a unique, individualized experience of itself through us and as us. I remember being told as a child, your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. There's something within you. There's a spirit within you. Where did that spirit come from, but other than some part of the divine? For there's nothing for the divine to create out of other than itself. Everything that we see is the self-givingness of God. Ernest Holmes would tell us that love is the self-givingness of God through the creative process. Everything that we see is the self-givingness of God. And that part of us that we call the soul. So then this idea that we left the garden, that we souls, we left the garden, we left this place in consciousness where we were more in tune and more aware of our close proximity with the divine. We left that garden to go out into the world, to have the experience of good and the experience of evil, to have the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. We went out into the world to have that because that allowed us to develop our uniqueness. And these terrible things that we experience along the way, the knowledge of evil, if you want to call it that we experience along the way, they cannot permanently keep us from rediscovering our oneness with God, rediscovering that we are, to some degree, we are it in expression as us. And when I say to some degree, the degree is as much of it as we realize, as much of it as we believe. What keeps us from fully experiencing the presence of God right here? Right? In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus told the disciples, the kingdom of heaven is here. It's now. It's everywhere present, but men do not see it. What keeps us from experiencing the presence of God is our ignorance, are these false ideas that we have, these ideas of separation. These are the ideas that we're breaking our way through. In all things give thanks, because it is the will of God. So now we can come back and we can say, wait a minute. These terrible things that have happened and these terrible things that will happen again, and these terrible things that have been happening for tens of thousands of years, these terrible things that are happening are only happening because we have not yet awakened. They are simply a part of the process of us awakening, and they too shall pass. And because our soul is part of that which is never born and which shall never die, then no permanent harm shall come to us. These are experiences that we have along the way. This is the knowledge of evil, the knowledge of good, and the knowledge of evil playing out in our lives as we make the discovery of who and what we are. Kennedy Schultz, who was the pastor of Religious Science Church in Atlanta for many years, said that in all things give thanks, meant to him that means that we own it. We own it. We take responsibility. We accept the experience as our own. And this is a big step forward because it means we're no longer considering ourselves a victim, but we own it. And we realize that everything that comes to us in life comes to us through right of consciousness. Now, it doesn't mean that any of us sit here and say, well, gee, I would like this terrible disease, or I would like this terrible tragedy, or I would like this terrible situation to come upon me. That, not at all. But it does mean that human race consciousness believes in the necessity of these things. It accepts these things. They always have happened. They always will happen. It's just an inevitable part of life. That's the way human consciousness thinks about these things. And our response is well, we'll go do unto them what they did to us, but we'll do it a little bit better, and we'll make them stop. That's about as far as we ever go in our tit for tat human experience. But Kennedy Schultz says, think about this. You are an expression of the divine. Life is a matter of consciousness. And if you find yourself in the midst of a terrible situation, give thanks, because you have the power to change it. You have the power to change your consciousness. You have the power to change your mind. You have with you, you have your will and your volition. You can decide that you want to change. But you also have the tool of the law of mind, which responds to you as you decide to change, and as you set in motion that change, there is a spiritual power that responds to you, the power by which prayer is answered. There is this power that then changes consciousness to allow the outpicturing of your desired change to take effect. In all things give thanks, for this is the will of God that you awaken. The will of God that you come to realize that you are not just a human being stuck in the human Groundhog Day where people will go on doing terrible things to one another forever and forever and forever. But we are, as Goldsmith tells us, we are in the Adam dream. Right? You heard me say it before. I love it. I got it from Joel Goldsmith. God created Adam, and Adam was lonesome, and Adam wanted a partner, and God put him into a deep sleep. Well, he removed part of his rib and made Eve. And nowhere in Genesis does it tell us that Adam woke up. So we're all stuck in the dream. We're all stuck in the Adam dream. And it's up to each and every one of us to break out, to awaken. So in all things give thanks, because we have the ability to awaken. We have the power to awaken. We have the spiritual practice to awaken. You know, if you think of a baby chick inside an egg, and I want you to think about how perfectly constructed this whole process is, right? This little chick is inside this egg, but it didn't start out as a chick. It started out as an egg. It had a yolk, and it had a white, and it had a little spot of blood right in the center. If you've ever candled eggs or ever seen them candled, you know, you can see the eggs that have been fertilized. There's a little spot of life in there. It doesn't look like a chick, but it looks like a little spot. But over time, what happens is that little spot grows, and it changes form, and it takes everything around it, you know, the yolk and the white, and it takes all of that around it, and it absorbs all of that. And it takes all of that, and it turns it into a chick. And then at a time determined only by the chick, it begins to peck its way out. See, that shell that protected it for so long, that gave it the time to grow and to form its own uniqueness, now it's holding it back. There comes a point where here's this chick stuck inside this shell. And there's something within it that knows that there's a whole other world out there. But what it must do is it must consciously cooperate or at least deliberately cooperate. I don't know how much consciousness we have in a chicken. But it knows when it is time to peck its way out. I think that what happens to us as we see these events in the world that take place like the ones that took place on Friday, if we consider what it means in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God, I think it serves as encouragement for us to peck our way out of the shell of human ignorance, of human hatred, of human belief. It gives us the motivation to carry on in all earnestness the process of our spiritual growth, which is the process of letting go of all of these human ideas and embracing the spiritual idea that life is a matter of consciousness and prayer, treatment. Prayer is a process and a tool that changes consciousness. So rather than get caught up in the fear-mongering, rather than get caught up in the hate, rather than get caught up in the drama, let's give thanks. Let's give thanks that we can awaken to our spiritual nature. Let's give thanks in our knowledge that these things do not have to continue and shall not continue. Let us give thanks in our knowledge that as human consciousness grows, the necessity of these things goes away, and you and I have been blessed with the ability to participate in the willful, deliberate change of human consciousness by starting with ourselves. Let us recognize that the love and the presence of God is in fact everywhere present, even in the midst of the horror, even in the midst of the chaos. There are, as you saw the meme going around Facebook, there are helpers, there are people who did extraordinary things. There's good going on right in the middle of that, which is evil. But let's not stop there. Let's recognize that this is a wake-up call for you and I, for each and every one, to stop accepting the normality of man's inhumanity to man. But rather, let's give thanks for the awakening to the spiritual nature within ourselves and with each and every one that is the motivation to peck our way out of this shell and into a greater experience of the oneness and the presence of God, where these atrocities don't even exist. Around the time of World War I, it seems that in times of great stress, there seems to be also a spiritual step forward. And around World War I, they found a little card, and in the Catholic Church we had little holy cards, like you have trading cards when you're a kid of baseball players and things like that. They had little cards, and it had just a little biography of the saints. And this was a card about St. Francis, and on the back of it someone had inscribed the prayer of St. Francis, which nobody knows exactly how long the prayer had been around, but they believe it was not actually, St. Francis didn't create the prayer, but it was a prayer about St. Francis because they found it on the back of a holy card about St. Francis. And in that prayer it says, "O Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love." And I think that's a wonderful prayer for all of us to remember in the midst of this insanity that we see in this world. But I would change it just a little bit. And I wouldn't say, "Make me an instrument of your peace." because we already are instruments of God's peace. I might say, Lord, help me to awaken to the fact that I am an instrument of your peace. And right now, where there is hatred, I am sowing love. And we're not going to solve these problems on the human level. Our hope is not in our human nature. Our hope is in our spiritual nature. So I ask you, invite you for this week, set aside your human reaction and go within to seek the kingdom, the presence. Go within to pray affirmatively, do your treatment. And recognize the presence and the activity of God within each and every person, especially within those who would do us harm. Let us recognize that for all those who have suffered loss, even the families of those who committed the atrocities, even those who committed the atrocities themselves, for each and every one who has experienced loss, that God's love is there. I invite you to move beyond our old human ways, which have been failing us for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and to step into the spiritual way which has been given to us by the great spiritual teachers of all times. Turn entirely away from the problem. Turn entirely toward God. Pray for your enemies. Bless those who would do you harm. Recognize that the will of God is for each and every soul to awaken to its spiritual nature. And let our prayers be for that. And so it is.